Were the 2024 Chicago White Sox the worst team in baseball history? Well, that question isn't quite as easy to answer as you might think. We do know that the White Sox lost 121 games in 2024. That's the highest number of losses since 1899. The media has widely reported that this was a record-setting performance, including this New York Times article. Well, the problem, of course, is that the 1962 Mets did not hold the record for most losses in a season, no matter what the New York media will tell you. That record still belongs to the 1899 Cleveland Spiders. They lost 134 games in a 154-game season. Now, those 1899 Cleveland Spiders were bad, historically bad. There's really no chance that we'll ever see a team that bad again. Spiders owners Frank and Stanley Robinson were so eager to ensure that the team would fold at the end of the season that they insisted that all scheduled home games after July would be changed to road games. It kind of worked except for 2 series in August. The actions of the Robinson brothers were so bad that it almost completely spoiled baseball in Cleveland, and it certainly harmed the legitimacy of the National League. Cleveland's last home game that season was actually played in St. Louis. They were merely listed as the home team. Louisville beat St. Louis in the first game of the doubleheader that day, and then the large crowd hung out to watch Louisville, the road team, demolish Cleveland in the second game, which was ended by darkness. Yeah, I know, most people don't count the 1899 Spiders since they were so bad. I mean, you know it's really bad if you legitimately were the worst team of all time, but most people ignore you anyway. But they really should count. As strange as 1899 was, it was still baseball, the same game we have today with the same rules. As Alan Schwartz reported in this old ESPN article, the last truly meaningful baseball rule change came about in 1893. That's when the pitching mound was moved to 60 feet and 6 inches from home plate. This is why 1893 marks the beginning of the modern era. You know, if we were to go back to 1899 in like a time machine, we would recognize baseball immediately. Sure, it might feel a little bit out of place with the wooden ballparks as opposed to our modern-day plastic ballparks. There weren't any lights back then. The speed of the game was a little bit faster. But honestly, it was the same sport. It was modern baseball. In other words, it was the modern era. Of course, the real question here is how the 2024 White Sox match up with other awful teams. For that, we can take a look at the Domination Index. Now, the White Sox were bad, really bad. The only teams that rank worse are the Philadelphia Athletics of 1943, 1919, and 1916. And honestly, the White Sox were not off by a lot. Each of those teams was far worse than the worst of the National League teams, with the exception of those 1899 Cleveland Spiders, of course. As bad as the 1916 Athletics look on paper, things really could have been worse. Connie Mack's ragtag team of unproven youngsters went through the motions as fast as possible. They played this October 2nd game at Boston in 1 hour and 19 minutes, for example. Though most people forget about this, the Mack men won both games of a doubleheader against the defending world champion Red Sox on October 3rd. That was the last day of the season. Boston, of course, had already clinched the pennant, and it was on its way to beating the Brooklyn Dodgers for another world championship. The Athletics would have finished with 34 wins and 119 losses if the Red Sox had tried a bit harder on that last day. Of course, the real story in Boston that day was the Braves sweeping the Phillies to give the Dodgers the pennant. That was amidst rumors of foul play by the New York Giants, who lost to Brooklyn. But we'll talk about all of that in another video. Now, the 1919 Athletics were also on that list of awful teams. If you're a replayer like me, that's one of the really awful teams that you should already be somewhat familiar with. The 1919 Philadelphia Athletics are well known among replayers for their huge roster, a whopping 49 players, which was the record for decades. 49 isn't much of a total these days, of course. By my count, the horrible 2023 Oakland Athletics employed 62 players. That's an absolute nightmare for the card and dice crowd. 41 of those were pitchers. Not to be outdone, the 2024 White Sox employed 63 players, many of whom likely will never play in Major League Baseball again. Unfortunately, the Philadelphia newspapers had a lot less to say about the ignominious end of that 1919 season. The 1943 Athletics ended the season losing to 42-year-old Grandpa Joe Heving. They put 16-year-old Carl Scheib out on the mound to face him. But then again, that was 1943, and there was a war going on that had a lot to do with all that. Okay, one of the interesting things about like the worst teams of all time is that they all have one thing in common. They all have owners that simply don't care. The great classic work on the worst teams of all time remains On a Clear Day They Could See 7th Place, even though this book was published 35 years ago. Among the teams featured in that book were the 1979 Toronto Blue Jays. They were notable for hiring basketball star Danny Ainge while he was still in college.
Went up the middle, base hit for Ainge.
Unfortunately, Ainge didn't know much about running the bases.
They've got him trapped off second, and he is out. What in the...
The 1988 Baltimore Orioles are also in that book, though they weren't quite as bad as some of the other teams I can think of. You might recall that this team lost its first 21 games of the season.
Just missed inside, down to second base. They got a run. At home, they got a run there.
I'd argue that the 1983 Seattle Mariners were worse, though the 1984 Mariners were actually pretty good, thanks to a number of excellent youngsters.
And the third baseman, Putnam, makes the catch.
The other awful team of 1988 was the Atlanta Braves. In fact, you could argue that they were even worse than the Orioles. Like the Mariners, the Braves were able to turn it around. In fact, this awful team formed the foundation of the incredible Braves teams of the 1990s.
And the Dodgers win the game.
Now, my personal favorite bad team was the 2018 Baltimore Orioles. In fact, I was at this game and watched in frustration as the Orioles lost to Houston 2-1 despite playing pretty well. The Baltimore Sun pointed out that the Orioles just might have been trying to follow the Astros' path to success. Now remember that Houston lost 106 games in 2011, after which they suddenly became a really strong team. Now, I don't know if it's accurate to say that the Orioles had to play so poorly in 2018 to win 91 games this season, but it does seem that this is the path to success. But you know, I don't think that's what's happening in Chicago. Rather, I think there's something a lot more sinister going on, and this is a story that the national media has largely ignored. The Chicago White Sox fans that remain have been unanimous in expressing their frustration and disdain for owner Jerry Reinsdorf, who honestly has my vote for baseball's worst current owner. The story you probably haven't heard is that Jerry Reinsdorf is trying to get the city of Chicago to pony up $1 billion for a brand new ballpark. Well, if you know your baseball, you're probably wondering, as I am, what in the world is wrong with their current ballpark. That would be New Comiskey, or whatever stupid corporate-sponsored name they've given it this year. It was opened back in 1991, which really wasn't that long ago. Reinsdorf and his henchmen have made all sorts of statements promising a strong economic boom from that ballpark, something that we know for a fact has never actually happened with a publicly financed stadium. And incredibly, Reinsdorf has been using the threat of moving the White Sox to Nashville to try to get what he wants. Well, that's the game, by the way. You hold a city hostage by asking for a huge amount of money and threatening to move the team to another city. Then you purposely tank to offend your fan base so you have low attendance. That way it's easier for you to convince other owners to let you move. And then you wait until the last second to make the decision. It's exactly what the Baltimore Colts did in the NFL, and it happens far too frequently. It makes me sick. I want to make a shout out here to the Chicago White Sox subreddit for all of this excellent coverage. That subreddit included a link to this article from Southside Weekly, which reported on the huge amount of money that the city had already paid to help improve New Comiskey over the past decade. And then there's this report from Forbes. This shows very clearly that the White Sox aren't exactly strapped for cash. Now, I'm a little bit biased. My dad and I went to New Comiskey back in 2001, back when I was 17. That ballpark might not have the retro appeal of our current plastic temples, but it really isn't quite as bad as people say. Actually, we went to the park early, hoping to find a stadium store that was open. Well, the store wasn't open, but the staff was very kind to us and allowed us to go out onto the field and into the dugout before the game. This was an experience that I'll never forget, and it's always made me have a soft spot in my heart for the White Sox organization. In a way, I would really be crushed if they tore down the ballpark to build another one of those stupid mall stadiums. Well, and then we need to talk about the history of the franchise. We've been over this before. The Chicago White Sox are the reason why the Western League became the American League in 1900, and fittingly, they won the pennant in 1900. Moving the team from Chicago doesn't make sense, and that's not just because of the relative population. Van Johnson had to fight tooth and nail to get the team in Chicago in the first place. Despite what some pundits say, the monopolistic nature of Major League Baseball guarantees that there will only be one team in Chicago if the White Sox are foolish enough to move away. Anyway, my apologies to fans of baseball in Nashville, but seriously, Major League Baseball would be much better off expanding the league than letting people like Jerry Reinsdorf move the White Sox away. Anyhow, that's my take on all this ridiculousness. What do you guys think? Why don't you let me know down below?